Going. Okay, so I wanted to welcome everybody to our second webinar of our six-part community engagement series. We are, for those of you who were with us last time, you're going to remember a little bit about this introduction, but for those of you who weren't, I want to let you know that we're thrilled to have Dr. Al Condeluci as our guide through this important work. And I'd like to just introduce you to Al. Al has had a long and illustrious career as a leader in the disability community since the 1970s. I think you might have corrected me on that last time. It might be earlier in the 60s, Al, so I need to correct my information. For many years, he was associated with CLASS, a full-service nonprofit organization providing services to people with disabilities. He has been an instructor with the University of Pittsburgh, both with the School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences and the School of Social Work. He is the author of 7 books that have been used around the world, focusing on culture, community, social capital, and macro change. And last but not least, Al is a family member to someone who has a disability and a grandfather to 3 wonderful little kids and and dad to a really nice puppy that some of us got the chance to see. So join me in welcoming Al this morning.
Great. Thank you, Sherry, so much for that kind introduction, and welcome back, everyone. Glad that to have you aboard for our second in a series of 6 sessions that we're going to be doing together. These first 2 sessions, the one we did 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, perhaps, and this session are full participation sessions. That is, we have close to 100 people scheduled to be with us today, as we did the last session that we did. And then as we move further into the series, when we get to session 3, 4, 5, and 6, we're going to be doing smaller cohorts so that we can have more interactive stuff, because those sessions, that session 3, 4, 5, and 6, are really more strategy oriented sessions in terms of meaningful inclusion and participation for people who happen to experience disabilities that we support, or really in any community for that matter, how those folks can be fully engaged. And so when we started our session a couple weeks ago, the focus was really on the history of disability. And we did a little bit of a kind of a summary. We talked a little bit about defining disability. We know that, you can experience physical, cognitive, or emotional challenges, and that get in the way of life, that would cause a disability label to be given. We know historically that people with disabilities have been devalued, and we went through the elements of devaluation, and that I think the ultimate insult in devaluation was the massive institutionalization of people with disabilities. And we reviewed institutionalization that's unfolded in Canada in our last session. But over a period of decades, more and more people with disabilities found themselves institutionalized. And in those institutions, bad things happen, right? And bad things happen actually in almost every institution in some way or another. And for those of us that were fortunate enough to not be formally institutionalized, like many of the people we support were, we still have experienced institutionalization in our lives. When you admitted to a hospital, or when you went off to university and you stayed in a dormitory, or military service where you're in a barracks going through the trainings that are part of that service. Those are forms of institutionalization where people are set aside or set apart from everyone else. the big issue that I think we tried to underscore in our first session was that institutionalization is sort of is a mentality, right? It's not just a place, although there are places where people get institutionalized, but it's really just sort of a way of thinking. And we know that many people that we support who have moved out of these large institutions um, in Canada and in the United States um, and moved into community-based services like we have at Community Living Kingston, um, end up in group homes or in some kind of a smaller congregative living situation, and in a way, those are those can become mini institutions um, where people really don't have control over their lives. That somebody else dictates and determines what they do and when they do it and how they do it, and that's a hallmark of institutionalization. Um, and so with that history or that background in place. And if you're interested, if you haven't seen our first session, as Sherry indicates, you can go back and take a look at it on the YouTube channel in order to sort of um, you know to frame some of this overview that I'm just giving right now. But today,
We just
today
lost you
our
for a second. Okay, there you go, Al.
God, I saw it. Our focus is really on social isolation and loneliness, because one of the byproducts of institutionalization is is being isolated, set aside, and in the throes of loneliness. And so we're going to take a look at that general topic today as we set the stage for what can we do at Community Living Kingston or any organization that's supporting folks that are at risk of being devalued to experience more meaningful opportunities in the community. So, Sherry, if we can get those slides up, that would be great. And then we can dive right into this topic. Okay? These slides, by the way, will be available to you if they're not already. So know that you don't necessarily have to take notes. You can get a copy of the slides and then be able to keep that in your in your notebook. And I would actually recommend that you do that, because some of the things that we're going to be focusing in on in our subsequent sessions are really going to be action strategies. And if you can keep all of this material together, it will really be, I think, useful as we get into strategies and actions. So today we really want to zone in on this notion of loneliness and social isolation, and to define it, describe it, measure it, and take a look at loneliness in Canada. We'll look at some statistics. And so, next slide, please. This notion of 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 loneliness gets compared to what people want, right? And every one of us on this call today who have had any experience in our field know that people want to be active in community and to be social and to be productive, that all people want these things, right? And in fact, this list, by the way, comes out of the work of Stephen Covey. And Stephen Covey wrote a very, monster book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, right? And what Covey did was um, examine what are the kinds of things that make somebody more effective in their life, no matter what work they do, no matter how they find themselves. And he lists these things as what he calls natural laws of society or natural laws of community, that all people want to be respected and treated with dignity. People want to be able to get around and see people. People want to develop and build relationships. That all people want this. Not just the folks that we're serving at Community Living Kingston, but all people. Your sons and daughters, and yourself. You want these things as well. They're universal. And one of the things Covey says that I think is really, I found to be um, really compelling, was that we identify natural laws of science, and we use those natural laws of science to sort of guide us in our behavior. For example, a natural law of science would be the construct of gravity, right? So if I have this pen and I drop the pen, I let it go, the pen falls, right? It falls to the desk. And basically that's gravity, right? It's that this pen is heavy enough, dense enough that it will fall down. So the natural law of gravity keeps us from, I don't know, jumping out of a window. That we know that if we jumped out of a window, we're going to splat down onto the ground, right? That's a natural. It's following and behaving within the structure of the natural law of science, which includes gravity. Well, these are natural laws of behavior, and what Covey argues pretty cogently in his books. In fact, I teach a course in human relations at the University of Pittsburgh, and I use one of Covey's books in my class. The book is called The Eighth Habit. It's one of Covey's newer books where he took the seven habits and added an eighth habit. But he really articulates these natural laws of behavior, and he points out that if you want to be successful in life, if you recognize these natural laws of community and you behave accordingly, um, that you're going to position yourself to be successful. Right? If you treat everyone with dignity and respect, if you respect people's productivity or their interest in wanting to be productive, if you recognize these things, they're going to help you be more successful. Next slide, please. But we know that some people are at risk of not being embraced in community and being treated in undignified ways. I mean, the whole session that we did last time on institutionalization is a perfect example of people being devalued to the point where they were put away. They were put away from society, and it was that suggested that they would be better off somewhere else. Now, this social isolation or this disconnection of people is really at the nub of the points that we want to make today. Next slide, please. That we know that when people are in a situation of loneliness or isolation, whether it's because they're institutionalized or whether because they just don't feel that they're respected or incorporated or included. um, these kinds of things unfold, right? These are bad things. um, Being excluded, alienated, makes people experience sickness more. It lowers confidence. It actually is toxic enough to be associated with mortality. And I'm going to show you some statistics in just a moment that really show that loneliness and isolation are toxic. They're they're akin to literally being in a situation where you're at risk of dying. Next slide, please. We know too that groups of people are at greater risk of social isolation, right? Um, and this is true kind of generically in Canada, in the United States, in other countries around the world, that we know the elderly, for example, are at great risk. In fact, in the United States, the American Association of Retired People, AARP, which is the trade association, has made loneliness and isolation its number one issue in terms of addressing from a policy point of view, from a legal point of view. So the elderly folks are at risk of becoming isolated, and you as you get older, you become more infirmed, and your infirmity makes it harder for you to go out, so you start staying home more. Your friends start dying or moving, or they become infirmed and they can't go out either. So elders are really at great risk of social isolation and loneliness, but not just the elders, folks that are economically disadvantaged, obviously people with disabilities and their families, single parents run the risk of becoming isolated or disconnected. Mental health issues, even ethnic or sexual orientation issues can lead to becoming isolated. Anybody who feels different, who doesn't feel embraced, who doesn't feel valued, can be at risk of being isolated or disconnected from other people. Next slide, please. Now, it's important right from the get-go that we understand that social isolation and loneliness are actually two unique phenomena, right? They're interwoven, but they are unique. Social isolation is a state where the individual lacks connections, right? Where they don't engage, or there's a minimal number of people in their lives. Loneliness, on the other hand, can occur in the presence or absence of social isolation. You can be socially connected and still feel lonely. I know in the work that I do, I do a lot of traveling, I do a lot of training and coaching, and pre-pandemically I was gone all the time, right? I would go somewhere to do some training or whatever, and when I was away, when I would be at some site, um, um, as connected as I think I am as a person, I would feel lonely, right? I would miss my family. I would miss my friends. I would, end up going back to a lonely hotel room. So you can be very connected and still be lonely, right? However, social disconnection is a stepstone to loneliness. So, and if we're looking to address loneliness, the first strategy is getting people connected, right? So they're tied together. Let me show you the next slide. The next slide um, really summarizes in a very succinct way that social isolation is objective. It can be identified, it can be mapped, it can be quantified, right? Loneliness is very subjective. It's felt and articulated by the person in different ways. The person might be in the midst of a lot of people and still feel terribly lonely. Whereas with social isolation, we can actually measure it. And one of the things we're going to get into as we start rolling out our you know our last four sessions is how might we more effectively measure people's connection in community. And we're going to use a scale. I'm going to introduce you next time we meet um, to a scale that actually attempts to do that, attempts to measure people's connections. measure where they go and when they go and who they go with and how often they go, places in the community. So we can kind of get our hands around that a little bit more. But loneliness is very subjective, and it also ebbs and flows. I got, when I'm away, I can feel lonely. The minute I get back, I feel I feel embraced, right? And so that's kind of setting specific. Um, at various times of the day. In fact, loneliness can be affected by weather, cold, gray climates produce a seasonal affect disorder where people do feel like they feel lonely. They feel like they're trapped in their house, right? So so loneliness and isolation, although they're related, are also unique. Next slide, Jerry. So this idea of loneliness has really been something that I've become fascinated with to the point of really researching and attempting to measure, because there has been, even though it's subjective, there's been efforts developed, and I'm going to introduce you to an effort in just a minute to address loneliness. Next slide, please. This is a quote from Jean Vanier. He says, "To be lonely is to feel unwanted and unloved, and therefore unlovable. Loneliness is the taste of death." Now, this is pretty powerful. It's a pretty powerful quote, right? That for something to be the taste of death. And data research has now been able to corroborate that this is actually true, that lonely people are at greater risk of uh, becoming sick, becoming depressed, and maybe even, taking their own lives, right? So loneliness is at the core of depression. We'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide, please. Now, Statistics Canada, and this is 2021 data, um, have begun to measure loneliness, and there's some institutes throughout Canada that are focusing attention on loneliness in Canada. And in my research in preparation for our session today, I found a couple very, very interesting um, groups. And we'll get into some of the things that they do in just a minute. But the Angus Reid Institute, um, the Samuels Center in Montreal that focuses in on connection, um, have have begun to try to sort of ferret out or measure loneliness generically in Canada, not just loneliness for people who have disabilities or have a precursor kind of a situation. More than 40% of Canadians feel lonely some or all of the time. That's a staggering statistic. Just it slaps you in the face, right? 30% of Canadian seniors are at risk of being lonely. We just talked about elders, and because they become more infirmed or because they begin to lose people in their lives, that puts them at greater risk. Young women and people not in couples report the highest level of loneliness, where 1 in 10 are always or often lonely. I mean, this is again pretty staggering, and it focuses in on on some precursor. And we all are familiar with the stuff that we see on the internet, right? And cyberbullying, and people criticizing or putting somebody down. Young women are really at risk in those kinds of situations. Next slide, please. This is the Angus Reid Institute has kind of they've kind of tried to catalog loneliness, right? And as you can see, in these 5 categories that they use in their measuring of loneliness, from desolate all the way up to cherished, right? and the steps and stages in between: lonely but not isolated, isolated but not lonely, moderately connected, cherished, right? And a quarter of the Canadian population that the Angus Reid Institute has attempted to measure fall in the desolate category in terms of what they report. So that this idea of loneliness and isolation is not a disability issue. In fact, it is a public health issue around the world. And I'm going to tell you, we're going to look at what other countries have begun to do or tried to do in addressing loneliness and isolation. And we're going to talk about those in preparation for what can we do in supporting men and women and children who have disabilities through our agency. What can we do to lessen the effects of isolation and loneliness? Next slide, please. Now, there's this this is a study that was done in 2010 in the United States, and it was done by this researcher at Brigham Young University in Utah. Her name is Julianne Holt Lunsted, and she's become really one of the biggest names in the literature of loneliness and isolation. But what they did is they followed 308,000 people for over 7.5 years. So it was like what they call a longitudinal study, right? And indicated that people who have social relationships have a 50% greater likelihood of survival, right? What that actually says is that connections, relationships, social capital, if you will, is as comparable of a antidote to the toxic effects of isolation and loneliness as quitting smoking is, or exercising to reduce obesity, or becoming more physically active. Now, everybody on this call knows, we all know that what we should be doing, right? We know that we should not smoke, and we know we should be physically active, and we should eat more intelligently, and we should do those things in order to um to make ourselves feel better, so that we can connect with people, so that we can survive, right? I mean, that's the trail here. And consequently, this study that Holt Lunsted did was really pretty powerful in beginning to equate social connection with survivability. Okay, next slide, please. So here is also costs associated with social isolation and loneliness, that the impact of being isolated, we can begin to measure the cost. In the United States, it's been estimated, and this is a 2020 study done through the AARP and Harvard and Stanford, two, just incredible universities in terms of research. And what they've discovered, and this is just 2020, this is just a couple of years ago, that almost $7 billion a year in the United States is expended to deal with loneliness and isolation. And this is mostly because of people losing productivity at work, or staying in the hospital or in some facility longer than they need to, because they don't have the community supports at home, right? So now similar studies have been done in Canada that have discovered that similar amounts are used to pay for the effects of loneliness and isolation. So this is not, again, just a disability issue. This is a public health issue for our countries. Next slide, please. Julianne Holt Lunsted, the Brigham Young University researcher I mentioned a minute ago, says that simply living alone or in an isolated place may be just as harmful to your health as feeling lonely. So it's a complex phenomena, right? That notion of addressing loneliness and isolation. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that was really fascinating to me in the research I've done on loneliness and isolation is that there's actually biological roots to loneliness and isolation. What I mean by that is as animals, we've been coded and scripted to when we find ourselves isolated or lonely for our biological functionalities to be affected. Um, Let me give an example. Say you go to a conference, in Toronto or I don't know, Montreal, and you're at the conference, you're staying at a hotel, and you decide you're by yourself, you decide to go out for dinner. And so you ask the concierge, they tell you there's a nice place a couple blocks away. You go to that restaurant, right? You have a nice meal. You're coming back and it's now dark, right? And you're in a city you don't know and you're by yourself. And as you are walking back from the restaurant to your hotel, and it's dark, um, what begins to happen biologically to your system is that the inflammation level begins to rise, respiration begins to rise, the circulation begins to rise, your nerves go on edge. And actually, every sound you hear gets amplified. You could hear walking behind you, you could hear noise across the street. Um, all of that stuff is essentially a survival mechanism for you because you're by yourself. And we know, our bodies know that if we're by ourselves, we're at risk. And so on the short term, these things happening help you survive that walk back from the restaurant to the hotel, so you don't get accosted or somebody pops out and comes at you. You pretty much manage through because your system is in the short term gets accelerated. However, these things happen when you're alone, um, and if you're alone all the time, they stay high, and consequently, there's risk for physiological things to go amiss. So literally, what we were coded for as animals gets affected over the long term if we find ourselves in a lonely or an isolated situation. Next slide, please. And this notion of depression, I mentioned it a minute ago. Um, Loneliness is a risk factor for depression, and depression increases mortality and cardiovascular problems. It diminishes serotonin and some of the enzymes that are used to relate and connect. It's been associated with stroke, um, arrhythmia, other bad things happening can happen when somebody is depressed. And sometimes you don't know somebody is depressed. They don't tell you they're depressed. They don't report it, right? And these things can then sneak up. Right? So, next slide, please. So people who are isolated have disrupted sleep patterns, altered immune systems, higher stress hormones, increased heart disease by 29%, stroke by 32%, in all counts, for a 30% higher risk of dying in 7 years if you're isolated or lonely or on your own. So, these things are incredibly toxic. We've been studying them. The Angus Reid Center has been studying the Samuels Center for Connections, been studying them. Universities and institutes around the United States, in the UK and Japan have been studying these things, knowing that they are toxic. Next slide, please. The New York Times recently reported that since the 1980s, the percent of American adults who say they are lonely has doubled from 20% to 40% since 1980. Similar research shows increases in Canada, Australia, and other nations. Right? So this is, and the pandemic actually made things worse, right? We all got stuck in that damn pandemic. We were isolated and disconnected from people. We were told to social distance, keep away, all the things that are actually um, the kinds of things that help us thrive. Um, we were told to back away from. Next slide, please. Now this gets me to one last study I want to talk about, and then really go over something with you in a little, not a little exercise or a conversation to address it. The UCLA, University of California at Los Angeles, has been a major font to study loneliness since 1968, right? And since 1968, UCLA has been attempting to measure loneliness, trying to gauge how lonely are people, and in an effort to kind of get a baseline, right? So they did a study in 2018. Now this is pre-pandemic, 2018, and they got Cigna Insurance Company, one of the big health insurance companies in the United States, to be a partner in this. And Cigna partnered with UCLA, and they looked at 20,000 Americans, right, from all over the country, in rural areas, urban areas, and in suburban parts, in the Northwest and the Southeast, the various places of the country. And they use a 20-item survey, which I sent to you, and we're going to bring it up in just a minute. Let me introduce it first. This scale has 20 questions, and as you answer the question, you begin to you're given a 4-point, what we call a Likert scale. What that means is you make a determination on a scale, always to never, and then the other two gradations in between that, right? So you have never, rarely, sometimes, often, right? And so each question is asked, and people answer the question. Now I put 3 questions up on this slide, but we're going to bring the entire survey up in just a minute. Right? Now, with this survey, what you do is you answer the question, right, by plotting where you fall in one of these 4 dimensions in the issue. For example, how often do you feel that you lack companionship? Do you never feel that you lack companionship? Rarely feel that you lack companionship? Sometimes feel that you lack companionship? Often feel that you lack companionship? Okay? So each of the questions you answer, you plot. Question 2, how often do you feel left out? Never. I never feel left out. Rarely feel left out. Sometimes I feel left out. Often I feel left out, right? It sort of walks you through making a choice of where you're at. Now, this loneliness scale is a moment in time, right? And and it can change. It can ebb and flow based on where you're at that time. So it's a snapshot. Like most action research is a snapshot in time, right? So Sherry, can we bring up this? Will we be able to bring up the loneliness scale on the
You
um,
bet. Give me 1 second,
hey,
and I should
thank
be
you.
able to share it now.
Now you should have a copy of this. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is use this scale with folks we support, right? Um, but so here's the first question. I feel in tune with other people around me, right? And if you never feel in tune, or rarely, or sometimes or often, I lack companionship. Okay? 3, there is no one I can turn to. Never, no one I can turn to. Rarely, no one I can turn to. Right? Now, sometimes the way these questions are worded are reversed scored, and I'll get to that in a minute. Um, I do not feel alone. Pretty simple question. Number 5, I feel part of a group of friends. Question 6, I have a lot in common with other people around me. Question 7, I am no longer close to anyone. And again, remember, relationships can ebb and flow in your life. If you're having trouble, you get a divorce, or break up with someone, how that can be pretty powerful at that point in time for you, right? So this can change based on your status, right? Like where you find yourself. My interests and ideas are not shared by those around me. I am an outgoing person. There are people I feel close to. My social relationships are superficial. I feel left out. No one really knows me well. I feel isolated from others. I can find companionship when I want it. There are people who really understand me. Again, they get plotted. You circle the number that you feel. Um, I am unhappy being so withdrawn. Uh, people are around me, but not with me. And that kind of being lonely in a crowd of people. There are people I can talk to. Always, rarely, sometimes, never. There are people I can turn to. Okay? Now, when you do this little test, then you score it. But you can see the scoring items that I've listed on the bottom of this sheet. And by the way, this scale is in the public domain, so it is you can find it on you can Google it and find it on UCLA's website. You can use it however you choose. But item 1, 5, 6, 9, 10, 15, 16, 19, 20 are reverse scored. And what that means is when you're scoring, because each question, creates a number, right? Or a value to that question. But the reverse scoring numbers, like for example, number 20, there are people I can turn to. Um, so if you say there's always someone I can turn to, right? That would be you would score that a 4, but when you tally it, it would tally as a 1. It's reverse scored, which means the 4 is a 1, the 3 is a 2, the 2 is a 3, and the 1 is a 4 in a reverse scoring framework. So it yields a total score. Right? Now, what UCLA has discovered when they've done this with the Cigna study is they've discovered that 43 total points is a cutoff. And The more points, the more loneliness is a risk. The less points, the more that the person feels like they are connected or like they have recourse to connection. So in some ways, what I'd like you to do, this will be a little homework assignment, is I would like you to do this on yourself, and then do it on one other person that you have access to. It might be a roommate, a friend, might be your spouse, maybe somebody you serve. Now, again, remember, some of these questions are abstract. So if you're doing this with somebody who has an intellectual disability, they may get confused by the reverse kind of notion of a question. For example, there is no one I can turn to. Number three, there is no one I can turn to, right? So when you're doing that with somebody, you really want to make sure they understand that that framework of question. There is no one that I can turn to. I do not feel alone, right? So when they're a little bit more abstract, and that's why they're a little more difficult with folks with intellectual disabilities, because you have to really decipher them and make them simplified. And I've worked on a scale that we've tried to make more simplistic, and we'll get into that as we go down the path. But I'd like you to do this and to get a sense of where you fall, and to also get a sense of, as you do this with somebody in your life, of how it can be utilized, right? So, Sherry, if we could go back to the slides, to the slide that we were at when we broke in. Oh, wait, before we do that, let me ask, let's pause for a minute and ask if there's any questions that you might have about loneliness and isolation, um, before we look at more results and then we begin to talk about what can you do about it. Any any questions that you have, or thoughts about this topic, either personal or as it relates to someone else? Now, remember this, one of the things UCLA really, really struggled with, and that's one of the reasons for some of the reverse questions on the scale, is that people don't want to report that they're lonely. That was the biggest problem that the UK had when they began to try to use some community strategies, is people would not admit that they were lonely because they really felt the social stigma. If I tell people I'm lonely, I'm going to look like I'm a loser. I'm going to look like people won't like me, that I just don't know what to do to get along. You know, it's it's hard for people to tell you that. Um, and this is equally true for us with the people we serve. You know, I think we can almost surmise that some of the folks that we support are pretty lonely, even though they may be smiling, and even though they may be telling you that they're not lonely. I think that we can surmise that they are. This issue of loneliness is so, you know, it's complex. Any questions or comments on anything we've talked about? Isolation, loneliness, the measuring of loneliness, an assignment for you, for our next time that we meet. We're going to be meeting in a smaller cohort the next time we meet, and have an opportunity to really explore some things in closer focus. But is there anything generally now that you might have?
There's a question from the chat, Al, from
Yeah,
Kelly. And her question is, are there any loneliness statistics post-pandemic? Are they the same or higher?
yeah, they're higher. The pandemic has actually vaulted loneliness to be even more of a pervasive problem in society generally around the world. And so the notion of the pandemic just exacerbated and really made things worse. Um, the other thing here is that post-pandemically, um, we're on our toes about social connections with people, um, because we don't want to catch. I mean, COVID is still with us; it's still a very real um, risk, and plus COVID is, aside from the fact of how sick people can get from it, it has these long-term effects for some people that they still don't know how to get rid of. Brain fog, heart related issues. And so that specter, post pandemically, is still out there. And so people are still a little bit more socially reticent. Um, and then you add on to that, the conspiracy stuff, the anti-vax stuff that that is out there. It really makes things even more, jumbled. So yes, the answer to that question is it has risen, and I'm going to show you a little bit more of the Cigna data that we used to introduce the loneliness scale just a minute ago, and then we'll roll into some actions that can be considered, and then we'll open it up for questions. So hearing no more questions, or if there's nothing else in the
We have
chat
one
room,
more.
good. Good.
One more just came in as you were saying that. Another question is, how does social media play a role in the measurement? We are so much more connected today than in the past, yet we have higher stats.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, there's an argument about whether we're more connected today with social media, and the the loneliness factor. I mean, you could have 5,000 friends on some platform, Instagram or Facebook, or select a platform, and still feel lonely. I mean, the mere fact of how people, what they portray on social media is sanitized, right? I mean, they portray the happy family, the great meal, picture of a great meal, the notion of wonderful relationship that people have, their anniversary, their this, their that. That all gets portrayed on social media in a sanitized way, and it doesn't really reflect the ups and downs of life, right? And the realities of that life isn't perfect. But some people, I mean, I'm sure you have some friends that you follow on Instagram or on Facebook or even on LinkedIn that are always putting out, they won this award, they've done that, they've written this book, they've got this certificate, all of that stuff then makes you feel worse, right? Because you say, "Holy shit, what about I haven't gotten a certificate, or gee, Manise, I haven't achieved that. Am I really?" And then that adds to depression, right? So that the notion of how you become so self-critical based on what you see in media is really powerful, right? I mean, it's a powerful thing. Like, wow, my life isn't perfect as her life is. When she has a perfect home, her kids always are smiling. My kids always are crying. You know, and then that notion of beginning to get bummed out. I'm doing the wrong thing. I'm not as smart. I just haven't been able to achieve as much. Then just exacerbates some of the perceptions that people have about themselves. And it's I think it's actually made things worse. Uh, there are some good effects to social media, no question about it. But by and large, I mean, this is the great debate now happening with artificial intelligence and with some of the other kinds of things that are coming down the pike technologically, and they're coming down fast. I mean, these things are soaring at us, and they're pretty powerful. We haven't really begun to measure the effects, the good and bad effects. I know a lot of research that's now unfolding on relationships, on social capital, on connectedness is happening virtually. It's really looking at the virtual medians for these kinds of things. But they also, are recognizing that there is this other best foot forward phenomena that happens with social media. I mean, how many of you have, this happened the other day. We were somewhere and we took a picture, a group picture, and I told my wife, I said, I'm going to put this up on Facebook. My wife said, no, 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 no. That man, wait until I get a better angle here, that kind of thing. And, and that's not just vanity. I think that there's something deeper here that unfolds in all of this. So it's pretty powerful and pretty compelling. So let's jump back into some of the construct that would begin to say, what might we do about some of this? Right? So next slide, please. So here's some findings from the Cigna study. This is 2018. And this is just things I pulled out of the report. If you were interested in this, and of course, this is just American data or findings. But nearly half of Americans report sometimes or always feeling alone or left out. We saw the Angus Reid Center found similar numbers in Canada. 2 in 5 Americans sometimes or always feel that their relationships are not meaningful or they feel isolated. 1 in 5 report that rarely or never feel close to people or feel that there are people that they can talk to. Only half of all Americans, 53%, have meaningful in-person social interactions. Only, that's 53%. That's a staggering finding. And Generation Z, which is basically the youngest folks, are the loneliest. These are the guys that grew up with, they grew up with these things, and they're on every platform that you can imagine. And yet they're reporting that they're the loneliest in this study. Now, social media use alone is not a predictor of loneliness, and they say in the report that there needs to be more studies that look at social media and its impact on loneliness. Next slide, please. So this is changes in loneliness and social contacts from 2018 to 2020. And again, this is pre-pandemically, right? And here's the data from October 2018, and then the data from March and June when it was collected using the UCLA loneliness scale. And look at these percentage jumps. This is unbelievable, right? From 27% felt isolated from others to 56%. That's a 25% increase, right? 28% had infrequent social contacts to 46%. So there's no question that loneliness and isolation are real issues. They're toxic. They're on the increase, and they affect all of us, right? That's just reality. That's a reality check. But it really then sets the table and say, well, what does this mean for us, right? What do we do about this? And as we begin to segue into some strategies, some recommended strategies, know that we're not just talking about this as it relates to what we do for the men and women we support at Community Living Kingston. I mean, we may not even have a sense of how lonely people might be that we're supporting. I don't know if we've ever even measured it or tried or thought about asking people, or try to ferret out, how pervasive is loneliness as a problem. Okay? Next slide, please. This is from the late, great Robin Williams, right? He said, I used to think that the worst thing in life was to end up alone. It's not. The worst thing in life is to end up with people who make you feel alone. Wow. This is a very powerful quote, right? Because for most of us on this call, we're with people who don't have very many connections, who don't have very many friends other than the people they go to programs with. Um, and, it begins to talk about, or this quote begins to suggest that we need to think about what we do and how we make people feel, but more importantly, how we position people so that they can find other people who will make them feel better about their life and about what their life means. Right? So next slide, please. This is the last data that we'll go over, and then we're going to look at these. This was a study that actually I participated in as one of the chief PAs, and we took 50 families that we had access to. 25 of those families had children that had IEPs or had some bona fide disability identified in their educational plan, right? And then we found 25 families who had similar children, gender, age, but did not have an IEP or a individual education plan based on a disability, right? So we had 50 families. And by the way, we repeated the study in Pittsburgh, and then we repeated it in Brisbane, Australia. And we used the social capital benchmarking survey, which is the instrument we'll look at our next session. And then we did qualitative follow-ups. Now, as you can imagine, this social capital benchmarking survey that Harvard developed is a survey that asks 40 questions, and those questions are, who do you know in your neighborhood? Do you go to neighbors' homes? Where do you go for fun? Who do you go with? How often do you go? It looks at that kind of stuff, right? And as you could imagine, out of the 50 families, both in the United States as well as the 50 families in Australia, the 25 families who had children with disabilities had less connections, right? I mean, they went less places and they did less things than the families who had children without disabilities. And so we did a qualitative follow-up where we interviewed those 25 families and who had children with disabilities, and we asked them, why aren't you going out? What's in the way? Let me show you the next slide. This is what we learned in the study. Here's what families told us related to how they navigate or try to navigate, or maybe just have bailed out because navigation is too hard. These aren't in any order of importance, by the way, or in any kind of a, best to last kind of a listing. One issue is economics, right? That for people to engage and for people to go out and do things, you got to have finances. You got to have money. You have to have disposable income, and that disability is expensive. That families who have children with disabilities don't have extra monies handy because they're paying for things that they need that their insurance company won't pay for. Logistical challenges. I know as a family member myself with my dad having Parkinson's, whenever we would go anywhere, go out to dinner or would go to a reception or a party, man, we had to do reconnaissance. We had to figure out where are we going to park? Can we get close to the door? Is it accessible? Is the bathroom? Will dad be able to get into the bathroom? I mean, all of those things were issues we had to think about. Increased medical appointments cut into the time that you have to recreate, socialize, and connect. Social stigmas, where families felt that other people didn't want them there. They rolled their eyes or they turned their head. If they were at, I don't know, Chuck E. Cheese and their child was having some kind of a, some kind of a reaction. Um, Fear that other people had, where they would back away, embarrassment that the family had in not being able to control. Like I was on an airplane coming back from, I was telling Sherry, I was down in Hilton Head playing some golf last week, and I was on an airplane flying back on Thursday night. It was full, the airplane was packed, and there was a family 2 rows behind me who had a child that screamed incessantly for the whole flight, right? Um, and the person sitting next to me, who I did not know, after the first 15 minutes of screaming, this person said, "Jesus, why doesn't she do something about that kid? Man, oh man, can't you shut the kid up?" Right? And and I just shook my head. I said, "Well, maybe she just can't. You know, don't you think she tried? Don't you think she was aware that her child was screaming and that was annoying everybody else on the plane? Of course, she knew it. She wasn't able to control it. So when we landed, and everybody got up to get their luggage out, and the poor mom, she you could just see on her face everybody staring at her, everybody holding her accountable for a child who either, maybe, I don't know, maybe the air pressure was just, the child was bothering the child's inner ear. Maybe the child just didn't have control. I don't know what it was, but that kind of stuff leads people to say, well, I'm not going on an airplane again with this kid. I'm not going to go to the church with this child. I'm not going to go to Chuck E. Cheese or wherever other people go. So the isolation and the loneliness exacerbate because of some of these tangible things. Okay? Next slide, please. So how do we address this, right? That's really, I mean, I'm beating you over the head with this loneliness and isolation stuff, and I'm sure you're saying, okay, Al, I get it, this is a problem. Tell me what I could do about it, right? Tell me what we might be able to do about it, right? And so here's just some general things that will be a part of the next 4 sessions that we have, right? We have to really examine the root of isolation and loneliness, and what it really is about. We have to think, we think it's internal to the person, but there's a lot of external messages that may that may affect this that we can control. So we have to ferret out the micro and the macro strategies. We have to understand social capital because the antidote to isolation and loneliness is relationships. And the more relationships people have, the less they're at risk of isolation and loneliness. I mean, that's those two things, that's just connecting dots, right? So we have to understand social capital. Our next session is going to be focused exclusively on social capital, what it is, what it means, what we know about it, and what we can do about setting the table for the people we serve to be in a position to develop more relationships. Some of that means that we have to understand change theory. Some of that means that we have to review um, international strategies that have been done. So next slide, please.
Al, just before the next slide, we do have another question or comment in the
Sure.
chat. Would this be a good time to bring it up?
Absolutely. Perfect.
So one of the participants has identified that unfortunately 2 of their best friends took their lives, and they looked to be happy and seemed to be enjoying life. Their family and friends couldn't see any signs. They all live with the guilt and at times blame themselves for not observing these signs. Is there any way that we could do anything to understand or read any symptoms or signs?
Yeah. Yeah, that is such a powerful issue, and we said earlier that people just won't report that they're lonely or isolated. They'll try to put the best foot forward, and in fact, that's exactly what happened in the UK. There was a minister, an elected member of Parliament. Her name was Jo Cox. She was young. She was single. She was attractive. She was smart, articulate, um, and everybody liked her in Parliament. She had no enemies. People just thought she was the best thing since sliced bread. And much um, like the person who raised the question, there was no there was no sense that Jo Cox was lonely or isolated or depressed until they found her dead in her flat, right? Um, and that they found her journal, by the way, when they were investigating her death. And in her journal, she really poured herself out, right? Of how desperate she was, how desolate she was, in spite of what everybody thought. They thought she was like the perfect person. And so that was a wake up call in Great Britain that if somebody like Jo Cox, who seemingly everybody loves, is lonely enough to put herself in a situation where she'd take her own life, that there has to be other people struggling with this, right? And so what they did in UK is in 2018, and this is pre-pandemic, they initiated a study. They called it the Jo Cox Commission. So if you go to Google and you Google Jo Cox, you'll see all this coming out. But what they did is they set up a commission to really take a look at what should they do in the UK to address the very same kind of question that came up in the chat room, right? This person took their own life and seemingly was perfect. That there was no signs, there was no telltale signs that they were desperate, right? So knowing that, what the UK has done, and we'll get into this in a little bit greater detail in just a minute, is that they created a ministerial office in the UK. That's like developing a department in Canada, or in some kind of a department in the United States government that focuses attention on loneliness. And so they actually put resources, financial resources into this. in an effort to really begin to say, how can we discover more? And so what I'd like to do is share with you a little bit of what they've come up with in the UK as strategies to try to address some of this. There's no magic wand though, and for the person who raised the question, I'm sure there's people on this call, who just don't feel 100%, but yet you'd never know it. You'd never know it when you interface with them, because we don't want to talk about this. It was like in the United States Senate when Senator Fetterman from Pennsylvania, my home state. In fact, I know John. He was the mayor of Braddock, which is one of our little communities just outside of Pittsburgh, and I worked with him on disability-related issues in Braddock. But when John got to the U.S. Senate, he and everybody, I mean, here's a guy, he's tall, he's 6'8", he wears these hoodies, he's got tattoos, I mean, he's not the picture of a U.S. senator. And so he became depressed to the point where he literally signed himself into Walter Reed Army Hospital, where he spent 3 months in the hospital dealing with his depression. 3 months. And so we've just the other day, when now that the writers are back from strike in the United States, and we have the talk shows back on in late night, he was interviewed by Stephen Colbert on the late night show, and Fetterman talked very honestly and openly about his depression, and about, here he was, a U.S. senator elected from the state of Pennsylvania. He had achieved all this stuff, and yet he felt so inadequate that he was just at the cusp of taking his own life. And but he sought out help, right? So how we can discover some of these things are really things that, hold on 1 second. Let me just send that to voicemail. Okay, so let's go into just a couple strategies that might answer, some of the things that the person who raised the question might feel. We have micro and macro issues that we're going to look at as we go into our 4 sessions coming up. Next slide, please. Micro change is really when we begin to look at the individual and what we can do with him or her that might help that person begin to become more engaged, more involved, and more active. And so let me show you some micro change ideas. Some of these have come out of the UK. Some of them have come out of Japan. Japan has done a similar thing as the UK. Next slide. So here's some micro interventions that are recommended in dealing with loneliness and isolation, right? Well, cognitive behavioral therapy, some of you guys are familiar with that. It's a methodology, a behavioral methodology. Sometimes that's helpful. In fact, that's what Senator Fetterman, that was the core of his treatment, was CBT. But social prescriptions in the UK, they're actually now writing prescriptions to socialize, and getting it funded through the public health initiatives in the UK. So social prescriptions, it's almost like that movie, What About Bob? That silly movie with Bill Murray and Richard Dreyfuss, where Bill Murray is OCD, and his psychiatrist is Richard Dreyfuss, and so he writes him a script saying, "Take a vacation from your troubles," right? He writes him a script, but social prescriptions are now becoming more and more utilized as a methodology for people. Social fitness exercises, things that can really help people feel more comfortable in social situations. I think this is a big one for us with our guys, because our guys oftentimes are not, um, they're not included in social issues. And what actually happens is we create little social worlds for them, right? But social fitness exercises are really designed specifically to make somebody feel a little bit more fluid, a little bit more comfortable. Like ice breaking practices, they're very similar. Ice breaking practices are things that we can coach people to do that will begin to set the table for a relationship, right? Um, Stop and think about your own life when you go somewhere new, um, and you're around people in a social situation, um, that it really requires some social ice breaking finesse to to begin to navigate in that in that situation, right? um so this notion of ice breaking practices, mindfulness, mindfulness as a technique, just to have people really be able to think about and to cognitively identify, you know things that they either like or maybe things that might be in the way. A cultural profile. We're going to do this next week. Or next time we meet, I'm going to actually share with you a cultural profile. We're going to actually practice with that profile, which basically have somebody examine themselves. Who am I? What do I have to offer? What what do I feel comfortable with? Right. So those are micro intervention techniques that make people feel better about themselves. Even this last one, this care force, um, what we in Pittsburgh, we attempted to address isolation using the United Way. And the United Way, we partnered with the United Way and to identify people who routinely go into communities, Amazon drivers, Amazon Prime drivers, um, utility workers, post postmen, postal delivery people, folks that are routinely going into communities to really begin to see if we could find people who are isolated, like mail stacking up, their yard needs, trimmed, just telltale signs, packages on the porch that people don't pick up or take into the house, little things that might help us intervene, right? So these are micro strategies. We'll go into more of these next week. But let's look at the macro strategies. Next slide, please. Macro interventions are much more policy oriented. They're much bigger. They deal with society and societal levels, norms of society, and values of society. So next slide, please. There are a couple recommendations. Yeah. So here's some macro interventions. Um, and we'll get into this in session 4. Community mapping, exploring what's out in our community, um, thinking about this notion of a gatekeeper, finding gatekeepers, um, softening the cultural infrastructure. This will make sense in our session, let's see, session 5. We're going to focus in on cultural infrastructure. Um, Finding ways to get our communities to be more welcoming, like community benches, conversation benches, having places where people can be welcomed in more of a macro kind of a way. Even holding world cafes and conversations in community about communities can be more welcoming, so that people who are nervous about or maybe uncomfortable about going out could be more welcomed when they get out there, right? So these are macro interventions. And again, as it relates to social isolation and loneliness, we'll get into those. Next slide, please. So in the UK, um, next slide will share some of the things about the UK. So what they did in 2018, they established a minister of loneliness. They initiated three major national actions, right? And that the first is to reduce the stigma. This gets to, the person saying, who raised the question, how do we reduce the stigma of people not wanting to admit that they're lonely? Making reducing loneliness a national agenda, that they put this on the map. This is something really important for our society. And then improving the evidence and data. I mean, really beginning to measure and get a better sense. So here's some of the things that they did on the last bullet. The social prescriptions I talked about, really looking at developing car services to be able to pick people up and take them places. Social hubs, especially in the rural communities where people could go and there was like these gathering places. Looking at statistics, national statistics, reimagining space to make it more welcoming. Right? All of these things they started to do in the UK. When we get to our last session, our sixth session, we'll get into some of these things as well. Next slide, please. So human conversation is the most ancient and easiest way to cultivate the conditions for change. Whether you're attempting to just have somebody feel better about themselves or whether you're trying to change the planet, around something. If we can sit together and talk about what's important, we begin to come alive. This is a quote from Margaret Wheatley, and it underscores this notion of world cafes. World cafes are community conversations about stuff that matters, right? And part of my agenda, and you're going to hear me on this again and again, is that I believe organizations like Community Living Kingston and my own organization here in Pittsburgh, Community Living and Support Services, have a responsibility to build community capacity. That this is definitely that should be within our wheelhouse. And this is not just take care of people with disabilities or do some CBT with them or teach them icebreakers. This is also, how do we change culture, right? How do we change the face of our community to make it more welcoming and more engaging? Next slide, please. Because it's not our differences that divide us. It's our judgments about those differences that divide us. What we think about the difference that really gets in the way. So how do we affect what people think about disability, in our case, intellectual disability, a physical disability, emotional disability? Next slide, please. Sir Francis Drake, a great, I love this quote because there must be a beginning to any great matter, but continuing until the end, until it be thoroughly finished, yields the true glory. So we've been on this voyage, right? Community Living Kingston is in its 70th year, right? And it was founded by families who wanted to get their kids out of institutions or wanted to prevent them from going into institutions and to build opportunity and community. That's why we were founded 70 years ago. Right? And so we've made some progress, no question about it. And we should rejoice in that. But man, oh man, we still have a long way to go. And we've got important things that we've got to get to. So let me get to the next slide. Let me just finish with this little story from Winnie the Pooh. Right? It occurred to Pooh and Piglet that they hadn't heard from Eeyore for several days. So they put on their hats and their coats and they trotted across 100-acre wood to Eeyore's stick house. Inside was Eeyore. "Hello, Eeyore," said Pooh. "Hello, Pooh. Hello, Piglet," said Eeyore, in a glum-sounding voice. "We just thought we would check in on you," said Piglet, "because we hadn't heard from you, and we wanted to know if you were okay." Next line. So, next slide. Eeyore was silent for a moment. "Am I okay?" he asked eventually. "Well, I don't know, to be honest. Are any of us really okay? That's what I asked myself. All I can tell you is that right now I feel really rather sad and alone and not much fun to be around at all, which is why I haven't bothered you, because you wouldn't want to waste your time hanging around with someone who is sad and alone and not much fun to be around, would you?" Next slide. Pooh looked at Piglet. Piglet looked at Pooh. And they both sat down on either side of Eeyore in his stick house. Eeyore looked at them in surprise. "What are you doing?" "We're sitting here with you," said Pooh, "because we're your friends. And a true friend doesn't care if someone is feeling sad or alone or not much fun to be around at all. True friends are there for you anyway. So here we are." Yeah. From a children's story, right? Next slide, please. So, "Oh," said Eeyore. "Oh." And the three of them sat there in silence. And while Pooh and Piglet said nothing at all, somehow, almost imperceptibly, Eeyore started to feel a very tiny little bit better because Pooh and Piglet were there. No more, no less. This is a powerful little story from a children's book about loneliness and isolation, and are all of us at risk of loneliness and isolation, and doing something about it, right? Pooh and Piglet did something about it. They noticed that their friend wasn't there. Their friend hadn't been around, and they did something about it. And they walked across the 100-acre woods, and they went to check on him, right? So the notion of loneliness and isolation are powerful realities in our society, right? And they're around us. It's not just for men and women with disabilities, although you and I know that they're at great risk of being isolated and lonely. And being lonely and isolated, how that feels, because we've been there. All of us have been there in some way, shape, or form. So the notion of basically addressing this, some things are simple, some things are going to be a little more complex. But that's the voyage that we want to go on in our next 4 sessions, right? What we can do about this, and how, what are some of the tools, what are some of the actual recommendations, what are some of the inclinations that we might consider. So my next slide is essentially, I think, Gandhi, right? We must become the change that we hope to create. Right? And the last slide is contact information. I always put this up on my slides. You guys know that if we don't get to questions you might have, or something comes up later that you resonate around, I want to be available to you. That's part of this arrangement that we have with, it's not just to do a session and then to roll away. It's really to be available for any kind of follow up or any kind of actions that we might be able to do. So what I'd like to do, though, now we have about 20 minutes, and I'd like to just open this up. Obviously, this session, because it's a large session, was really designed to be more content oriented, and that, in terms of the interactive stuff, we're going to start that the next time we're together. But for today, it was just to sort of present. Last time we met, the devaluation of people with disabilities, how that devaluation led to institutionalization how institutionalizations really just separated people from the community. Community living of Kingston was founded 70 years ago to change that, to turn that around, to really create passages for people to become part of their community. And so it is 70 years later, and we know that the men and women we support are still stuck. They come to things we do, they get involved in programs. But in terms of really true relationships and connections and really feeling connected and feeling embraced and welcomed and acknowledged, that we still got some work to do there. And so these two sessions really set the tone for the action orientation that we want to take on next time we're together. So I wanted to open it up and see if you had any questions or comments or reactions to anything I said, as we get prepared to launch more interactive kinds of things when we get together on the 31st with our first cohort. By the way, we're going to be doing 4 cohorts for session 3. So we're going to repeat them. They'll be the same for each of the sessions, but they're going to be very interactive. I have some trigger questions. We're going to do them in the breakout rooms. We're going to think together about what we can do. But for now, are there any questions or comments that you might have based on anything that we've said or anything that you've been thinking while we said it? You can raise your hand or drop something in the chat room. If you don't want to raise your hand, that's okay too. Or if you don't have a question right now, that's fine too. I'm not trying to goat you into feeling like you got to raise a question. That's, if you want to digest this, I mean, this is pretty heavy stuff. And it's, and it's personal stuff. It's stuff that we all have experienced. This is not about people with disabilities. It's really about us, the Kingston community. How welcoming are we? Well, how, the people who feel different, can they find a place? Yeah. Questions, comments, reactions.
I can jump in and say the the statistics that you brought to us at the beginning of the session, Al, are pretty staggering. How many people suffer from loneliness and isolation, and it just
Yeah.
bears the question, why is that such a surprise? If there's so many of us that have experienced this.
And we have all kinds of means to try to address that. I mean, it's almost a paradox, from a sense of we're living in the most connected of times, and yet we have the highest degree of loneliness and isolation. It just doesn't make sense, but it's real. I mean, the statistics aren't lying, and they're consistent in Canada and the United States and Australia and Great Britain and Japan. They're the same everywhere. So, there's clearly it's complex, but I think, you guys may have heard me say this before. There's a Japanese word concept called shibumi. And shibumi, we don't have a similar English word that describes shibumi, but shibumi is the blending of simplicity with complexity, right? It's when, like, a Japanese garden is shibumi. As if you've ever been to a garden center or whatever, and you've seen a Japanese garden, wow. I mean, it's simple, right? The garden is simple. There's some sand, there's some rocks, there's a bonsai tree, right? It looks pretty simple. But then when you look at it a little bit more, you see the complexity, right? The sand is raked just so, and the boulders are lined up just so, and the bonsai tree is trimmed just so. It's a very complex the gardener is expressing him or herself in a very complex way with that garden. So it's a shibumi concept. And so is a bridge, right? A bridge is a shibumi concept because a bridge connects people, to be together, right? People who are on one side to go over to see people who are on the other side. But yet, so it's a simple concept, but yet it's complex. If you go underneath a bridge, you see all it's arched and the girders are just so, and it's designed to establish this, you take the weight, and there's a fence so people won't fall off, right? There's all this complexity. So it's shibumi. And then that's exactly what loneliness and isolation are. They're shibumi concepts, right? And we all go through them. So it's not like it's just for somebody else, but it's complex in that, some people just won't admit it. Some people just don't have access. So I mean, if you stopped and asked any of the persons that we support at Community Living Kingston, you know, would you like to do more things? you know, would you like to go more places? Would you like to participate in more things? I mean, I think people would just say, yes, of course, yeah. Um, but then getting people to participate, and getting the other people who are in the point of participation to open up their hearts and minds and arms, that's the challenge. That's the complexity. And so it sounds simple, but it's complex. And that's why we broke it down into these 4 sessions, because you know the the understanding social capital, doing a cultural profile, really examining where people are at, and then mapping the community, what exists out there, and what how where did it start, how did it start, how do they behave, right? And then step 3, what are the routines and the expectations of that community group? And then 4, who's the gatekeeper who might be able to broker a connection, right? Those 4 things are the strategies of community building. They have micro pieces, they have macro pieces, and but unless we tend to the community, everything or anything we do at Community Living Kingston is not going to really make much change, right? I mean, we have to think macro. We've got to think about how do we change some of the perceptions and attitudes of everyday people who go to the book club, or everyday people who go to the gym, or everyday people who go to the to the garden club, and that that's the secret to inclusion, I believe. Is that easy? Hell no, it's not easy. Um, but are there things we can do? Absolutely, there are. Are there ways we can measure something? Yes, we can. Are there ways that we can really ally and align? Ways that we can host community conversations? Yes, yes, we can do those things. And so I think that's really the spirit of this community engagement series that we put together. And we put this together, Sherry and the leadership team and myself, and we talked about it, we looked at the topics and the content. So it's something that we all agree has got to become part of our strategy as an organization. Because if it isn't, the next 70 years will be just more of the same, and we'll have some nice programs for people to go to, and they'll feel safe, but they'll still be alone and disconnected. Um, so I mean, I'm just so excited to be a part of this conversation and this journey, this voyage that we're on. And I love the vision of Community Living Kingston in terms of its recognition that there's more there, not more work we have to do. It's just that we have to think more strategically. We've got to think more macroscopically in what we do. And so I think those are the things we'll broker over the next, 4 sessions that we're going to be together.
Al, we do have a couple of questions that have come in through the chat.
Great.
In reference to some of the UK strategies.
Yeah.
We have the question, Minister of Loneliness, how would that work in a federal government? And then I guess further to that, what exactly would a social prescription look like and how does that work?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I think both, Canada, and to a lesser extent, the United States have been awakened to the loneliness isolation issue, right? Um, in the United States, our Surgeon General just came out with a proclamation that identified loneliness and isolation as significant public health problems. So just that recognition is an important start point, right? Um, and the UK and Japan have been bold enough to say not only do we recognize it, but we want to formally try to do something about it in our policy. And so they formed this ministerial level. So essentially in the UK, the Minister of Loneliness is essentially reports to the Prime Minister, has their cabinet level position. And so they go to all the cabinet meetings and they report about connectedness and people's engagement with one another in the UK. And it's risen to become just as important as as defense or any of the other levels of government that we have in Canada or in the United States. I think it's a long way off for the United States to ever admit something like this, and especially in our political reality of MAGA and Trump, stuff of that notion of if somebody's lonely, they're a weakling. And if you're a weakling, Trump doesn't like you, right? He only likes winners, that craziness. But when you have a political sort of, atmosphere that really doesn't want to admit the frail part of society, the vulnerable part of society, then society will never deal with it, or they'll sweep it under the rug, or they'll just say, well, that's touchy feely, that doesn't really belong in government. And of course, in the United States, there's a movement to try to lessen government anyway. So I think it would be like a cold day in hell before a a department, a government level department, would be authorized to address something like this. I think Canada, not so much. I think that there's much greater social sense in Canada. Um, there's a much more of, I think, openness to difference. Not that you don't have your warts and troubles. You do. Um, but I think that opening up a community conversation in Canada, I think, is so much more palatable than in the United States, especially now in the United States. Maybe that'll change. Let's hope it might change. But for now, I think having this kind of conversation is really challenging in the United States. But I think you know the notion of starting smaller, maybe even in the Kingston um, public policy framework. Um, you have a mayor, right? A mayor in Kingston, and a cabinet, or not a cabinet, but councilman,
Council.
or
Yeah.
yeah. So you have that. the possibility, I think, of even generating a conversation at that level might really be intriguing. Like what, that notion of because this is not a disability issue, right? This is an inclusion issue, and it's an inclusion issue for anybody who feels different or is who or somehow some way has been treated as different. And so because of that, I think maybe from a strategic point, and Sherry, you and I and the leadership team, we may go down this lane, maybe not, as we get closer to the end of the series. But um, the notion of really petitioning the community, um, maybe aligning with some other like-minded organizations that support people who are vulnerable, elders, immigrants, LGBTQ folks, mental health kinds of issues, aligning with other people who are at risk of isolation and loneliness to really talk about systemically how do we make Kingston a more welcoming community. And maybe we go down that route, maybe not. At the end of this session, but I think we're going to bump into that somewhere along the trail, because it's inevitable, that this is a macro. It's not just a micro. You can't blame the person with disability for being lonely. It's a macro kind of thing. If somebody's lonely, there's other people who are also a part of that phenomena that haven't opened up to them. So, but
Al, we
those are
have an, oh,
questions.
sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say there is another question in the chat, and it's one that's probably on many of our minds. How do we ensure that we are addressing loneliness with individuals that struggle to communicate their own needs?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That is really a great question, because the the methodologies used to try to ferret out nonverbal folks in terms of where they're at and how they feel about this. Um, there's been some interesting things happening in that front. Assisted communication techniques um, are are really looking at that. That how might we begin to sort of pull out how someone feels who's non-communicative, and there are not might be there are methodologies to assist with that. For example, when we next session we're gonna look at a cultural profile, and on the cultural profile, there are questions, and you'll see this when you get this information prior to our next meeting. Um, there are questions about what people like, what they want to know more of, and what would they like to engage in, right? And if somebody can't read those questions or don't understand when somebody deciphers the question, you can create, and we have created, images, pictures that show the activity, and you get people to look at the picture and perhaps react to the picture. Now, sometimes, depending upon the severity of the communication issue, that you just sort of observe people. Like, for example, there's a group in Baltimore that was doing some fascinating stuff by showing images and then watching people's pupil dilation. As weird as that sounds, because we know that the pupil dilates when you see something that you like, when you see something that you're attracted by, right? Um, and so with nonverbal folks, they were using this kind of methodology of showing a stimuli, a picture of people doing something, and then just observing what pictures seem to resonate more with the person that they were interviewing, with the photos, and then using the pupil dilation as at least some potential sign of interest in that particular activity. Right? That's a little bit. That's kind of going a little further down the path here, but guided communication in Australia, they've been doing some really interesting things, and I would imagine, you guys have done some of this facilitated communication, where you use basically almost it's sort of like a Ouija board kind of a format. Have you seen that, Sherry?
Yeah, yeah,
Communication. So there's more methodologies coming of age to try to address nonverbal challenge that we have here. Part of my thesis here, part of my recommendation is that when we look at the people we're supporting, um, we do some triaging. Okay, and what I mean by that is um, rather than try to get the most severely disabled person who's non-communicative and seemingly we really don't know, exactly what's going on, rather than start with that person, I would rather us start with a person who we can discover in a much faster way what they like, what they care about. Often what I do is if I make a visit to an organization, I'll walk around and just in some common area where people that they're serving happen to be, and basically just begin to say, like, why is this person here? They should be out. Like, why are they coming to this program? Now I could see some other people who I understand why they're coming to the program, because there's some challenge there. So in triage, what you do is, classic medical triage, you sort of, when a wounded person comes into the medical tent, the triage is, will this person survive without intervention? Will this person die with intervention? And you take those two batches out, and then you say, here's the group that we're going to focus attention on with our limited resources, our limited time, our limited ability. That doesn't mean you give up on people. It just means you got to start somewhere, and we should start smart, right? If we're trying to influence community and trying to get community to become a little bit more receptive and more willing, then we don't start with our most challenging situations there. We start with the situations that we can ease into those community experiences. And as we do that, the community becomes more receptive. So now at some point, the most challenged person can fit in because the community is elasticized through some of these experiences. So I think we want to just think smart here. We're serving a lot of people, and so we're not struggling to try to find, can we identify people who will be a part of this? We got a lot of people that we're supporting. So I think we want to try to maximize our impact initially. So I know we're over time, and I know that folks have things they've got to do. So, is there anything else for the good of the cause before we sign off?
I was just going to say the exact same thing. I know that we're a little after 12, so if people do need to get to go, by all means, do so. There is one more question, Al, if you want to indulge it. Um,
Absolutely.
Renew has asked, what is the difference between social isolation and lack of social support?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question, because social support is essential to offset social isolation. It's just the kind of support, the type of support, and what those support variables are. Right? Some of those support variables might be um, just a person there with you to make sure that if anything unfolds that's problematic, can be can be lessened. Um, Other social supports might be things that could be um, more like for example, finances, financing uh, a person's ability to go somewhere. That's not necessarily having a person there. It's really having the resources to underwrite the cost of the person being there. So I think when we look at social supports, when we do the analysis of what people like, what they care about, what they're interested in, then there is, then there is the next step of what do we need to do, what supports are necessary to get us to that place, right? Um, that'll come up here's the chronology, and I don't mean to go too deep into this because we'll cover some of this in our next session. But the next session 3, is social capital. How do you do it? What is it about? What does it mean? Then community mapping. What's out there? What's possible? What do we need to know about it? Step 3. What is the social architecture of the community group? How do people behave? What do they expect? Right? And then the fourth step, finding the gatekeeper who will help orchestrate the connection. That's where the social support piece comes in, because at that point in the challenge is when we insert, whether it's staff support, whether it's financial support, whether it's equipment support, whether it's transportation support, we add that piece in at that point. That's called the cultural penetration piece of the puzzle. So we'll get into that. I think it's a great question, and it's very forward thinking. But we will cover that as we move through now these strategic pieces of the puzzle.
All
Okay?
right, I think that covered everything in the chat, Al, and thank you so much for hanging around a bit longer,
No, no,
folks, and
no,
Al
no.
to cover those important questions. And thank you, Al, for today. It was, as usual, very informative and thought-provoking for all of us.
Great. Thank you, guys. I'll see you next time. I think the 31st is our first cohort. Sherry, you and I will set some time up to get into some of the details on that. And we'll do
That
that next week. And then I'll just see some of you. Well, I'll see you guys over the course of October, November when we do the next sessions.
just in smaller groups, so it'll be a
Yes,
little easier to chat for sure.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
guys. Have a great rest of the day. Bye now.